In the 12th century BC, the most advanced civilizations on Earth didn't slowly fade away. They didn't decline over centuries. They collapsed, almost simultaneously, within a single generation. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Cypriots, even Egypt. Some disappeared, others survived, broken beyond recognition. And the strangest part? We still don't know exactly what killed them. Was it invaders? Or something else entirely? Something we haven't found yet. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, the day civilization died. To understand how catastrophic this was, you need to see what was lost. The Late Bronze Age wasn't a primitive time. It was an era of palaces, of international trade, of diplomacy between kings. The Mycenaean Greeks built fortress cities with walls so thick they were later called Cyclopean, because people believed only giants could have stacked those stones. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, rivaled Egypt itself. Their capital at Hattusa covered nearly 2 square kilometers, with temples, archives, and fortifications that dwarfed anything in Europe. The Minoans on Crete had been the first great European civilization. Their palaces had indoor plumbing, colorful frescoes, and multiple stories, 3,000 years before modern architecture. At the center of Minoan religion was the bull. Young men and women would grasp the horns of a charging bull and leap over its back. Part sport, part worship, part defiance of death itself. The Minoans also wrote, but their script, known as Linear A, has never been deciphered. Thousands of tablets survive, filled with symbols we can see but cannot read. Their language, their thoughts, their names, all locked behind a code that has resisted every attempt to break it for over a century. And Egypt, the greatest power of them all, had reached its zenith under Ramses II. Its influence stretched from the Nile to the Levant. Ramses II ruled Egypt for 66 years. He built more monuments than any pharaoh before him. Temples carved into cliff faces, colossal statues 60 feet tall. A capital city, Pi Ramses, that dazzled visitors from across the ancient world. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh in 1274 BC, the largest chariot battle in history, with an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 chariots on the field. The battle ended in a draw. Both sides claimed victory, but then something unprecedented. Ramses and the Hittite king signed the world's first recorded peace treaty. Two empires that had spent decades trying to destroy each other, bound by silver and seal. Within a century, the Hittites would be gone. Egypt would survive, but it would never be the same. These weren't isolated kingdoms. They were connected by trade routes crossing the Mediterranean, by treaties between kings, by a diplomatic network that spanned the entire known world. Tin from the far edges of the known world, copper from Cyprus, lapis lazuli from Mesopotamia. Luxury goods, weapons, and ideas moved across thousands of miles. Cuneiform tablets found at Amarna in Egypt contain letters between pharaohs and foreign kings discussing marriages, gifts, and alliances. They addressed each other as brother. This was the first international system, the first globalized world. The most remarkable evidence of this world survives not in a museum, but on the sea floor. A single ship found off the coast of Turkey, known as the Uluburun wreck. It carried copper ingots, tin, amber from the Baltic, ebony from Africa, ivory, and a gold scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian queen. One ship, the entire known world in its hold. And then it all fell apart. The first signs appeared around 1208 BC. Egypt's records describe an attack by a group they called the Sea Peoples. Ramesses III carved their names on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu. But who were the Sea Peoples? That's the question that has haunted archaeologists for over a century. The Egyptians listed groups with names like the Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Luka, and the Ekwesh. Some may have been from Sardinia, others from Anatolia, but their true identities remain debated to this day. The Egyptians gave us something no one else did: pictures. At Medinet Habu, the Sea Peoples are carved in extraordinary detail. Feathered headdresses, round shields, long swords, ships with bird-headed prows. We can see them, we just can't identify them. One group, the Peliset, may have become the Philistines of the Bible, settling on the coast of Canaan after the collapse. If so, the Sea Peoples didn't just destroy civilizations. In time, they became one. What we do know is that they came by sea, and wherever they landed, destruction followed. But the Sea Peoples weren't the whole story. Something else was happening, something deeper. Around 1200 BC, the climate shifted. Studies of ancient pollen and lake sediments show a period of severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed, famine spread, and when people are starving, they move. Earthquakes struck too. Archaeological evidence points to a cluster of major quakes across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean around this time, toppling walls that had stood for centuries. But earthquakes and droughts had happened before. The late Bronze Age civilizations had survived worse. So why didn't they survive this time? Because the collapse wasn't a single event. It was a cascade. Each civilization fell into the next, and the next had nothing left to give. The late Bronze Age system was dangerously interconnected. Lose one piece, and the whole thing unravels. Trade routes were the lifeline. When the Sea Peoples attacked coastal cities, they didn't just destroy buildings. They severed the arteries of the entire system. Without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no weapons, no tools, no status symbols. The foundation of these civilizations crumbled. Consider what tin meant. It wasn't just a metal. It was the difference between a palace and a ruin. Every sword, every shield, every plow blade depended on a supply chain stretching thousands of kilometers from distant tin sources to the Aegean. When that chain broke, even temporarily, bronze production stopped. Armies couldn't be armed. Farmers couldn't plow. Cities couldn't be built or repaired. The whole machine seized, and the palaces themselves made it worse. The Bronze Age economies were centralized. Everything flowed through the palace. The palace collected taxes, stored grain, managed trade, paid workers. When the palace fell, there was no backup system, nothing to catch the people below. This is what archaeologist Eric Klein calls a perfect storm. Not one cause, not two, but a convergence. Drought, famine, earthquakes, invasion, internal rebellion, systems failure, all hitting simultaneously, each one amplifying the others. Ugarit was one of the richest trading cities in the ancient world. Located in modern-day Syria, it was a crossroads where Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Mediterranean cultures met. The last king of Ugarit was a young man named Amurapi. When the attacks began, he wrote desperate letters, pleading for help from every ally he had. One letter survives. Addressed to the king of Cyprus, it reads, "My father, the ships of the enemy have come. They have burned my cities and done great harm." But help never came. The reply from Cyprus reveals that its own cities were already under attack. Amurapi received the reply and understood. There would be no fleet from Cyprus, No soldiers from Egypt, no grain from Hittite. Every ally was fighting for its own survival. Ugarit stood alone. The final days may have looked like this. He ordered the city's granaries opened to feed the people inside the walls. He organized the defense. He moved the women and children to the inner citadel. Then he waited. We don't know what happened to Amurapi personally. His name disappears from the record after his last letter. Ugarit burned. The palace collapsed, and with it, everything he'd tried to hold together. It was never rebuilt. Excavations at Ugarit found tablets still in the kiln where they were being baked. The city was destroyed so suddenly that its scribes never finished their work. One tablet stands apart from the others. A letter never sent, written by a scribe in the city's final hours. It describes grain shipments that would never arrive, allies who had already fallen, ships spotted on the horizon that turned out to be enemy vessels. The letter breaks off mid-sentence. The kiln that destroyed the city preserved the words. Meanwhile, the Hittite Empire, the great rival of Egypt, was crumbling from within. The Hittites had been weakened by internal succession wars. Their vassal states were rebelling, and their grain shipments from Ugarit and Egypt had been cut off. Hattusa was sacked and burned. The massive fortifications that had protected the Hittite kings for centuries couldn't save them. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for over 400 years, vanished as a great power. With the Hittites, we lost more than a kingdom. Their law codes prescribed fines instead of physical punishment for most crimes, remarkably progressive for the 13th century BC. Their royal archives at Hattusa contained thousands of tablets, treaties, correspondence, annals spanning centuries. When the city burned, the fire that destroyed the archives also baked the clay tablets hard. Once again, destruction became preservation. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces burned one by one. Pylos, Mycenae, Tyrans, Thebes. We know Pylos saw it coming. Tablets found there, written in the days before the attack, record frantic preparations. Coast watchers posted at every headland. Rowers conscripted from inland towns. Bronze stripped from the temples to make weapons. The scribes kept writing until they couldn't anymore. One tablet records that 60 rowers were sent to Pliron. Another lists offerings made to the gods, perhaps a last prayer before the storm. The fire that destroyed Pylos baked those tablets permanently into the archaeological record. Without the destruction, we would know far less. The catastrophe preserved its own evidence. Within a generation, the Mycenaean writing system was lost. Greece would not see writing again for 400 years. The craft of palace building, the art of fresco painting, the technology of bronze working, all of it gone. Cyprus, the copper island that fueled the bronze trade, was overrun. Its fortified cities were abandoned. Even Egypt, the greatest power of the age, was shaken to its core. Ramesses III recorded his victory over the Sea Peoples in dramatic relief carvings at Medinet Habu. He claimed to have defeated them on land and sea, but the victory came at a cost. Egypt would never again project power beyond its borders. The age of the great empires was over. So what actually caused the collapse? The honest answer is everything, all at once. Archaeologists call it a systems collapse, the term for when interdependent systems fail together. No single cause, no single victim, Everyone pulled everyone else down. How quickly does complexity unravel? When the Bronze Age system broke, the answer came back in years, not centuries. Cities that had stood for generations emptied within a generation. And then there's the human cost. When the palaces burned, the people didn't just lose their kings, they lost their entire way of life. For centuries after the collapse, much of the Eastern Mediterranean entered what archaeologists often call a dark age. Writing disappeared in Greece. Trade dried up. Population levels dropped dramatically. Some regions saw up to 75% reduction in settlements. Without palaces, without trade, without bronze, people fell back on what they had. Small villages, family farms, stone tools, subsistence. The population of Greece may have dropped by as much as 2/3. The pottery tells the story. Where Bronze Age vessels were painted with intricate scenes, ships, warriors, animals, Dark Age pottery is plain. Simple geometric patterns. The decoration disappeared with the culture that created it. Villages became isolated. Without long-distance trade, every community had to produce everything it needed. A village that couldn't grow food, make tools, and defend itself died. Only the self-sufficient survived. And yet, people endured. They always do. Even in the darkest centuries, humans were building fires, raising children, telling stories. The knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It went underground. It waited. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age became legends. The Hittites faded from memory, surviving only as a name in scattered ancient texts until 1906. A German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler began digging in central Turkey and found the royal archives. The forgotten empire suddenly became history again. The Trojans, if they existed, were folded into myth. The Trojan War, perhaps rooted in historical conflict, became Homer's epic poem, told and retold until history became story. This is how civilization survived the Dark Age. Not in writing, not in stone, but in the human voice. Stories of great kings and terrible wars passed from mother to daughter, father to son, generation to generation. When writing returned to Greece 4 centuries later, among the greatest things they preserved was Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the memory of a world that had ended. Even the sea peoples themselves vanished into mystery. The Egyptians recorded their names, but those names don't match any known civilization. Were the Shurden from Sardinia? Were the Eqesh actually Achaeans, the same Greeks who built Mycenae? Or were they something else entirely? Displaced people, driven from their homes by the same disasters that were consuming everyone else. Some scholars believe the sea peoples weren't a single people at all, but a wave of refugees. People displaced by drought, famine, and earthquakes who banded together and struck at the civilizations that still had food. If that's true, the Bronze Age collapse wasn't an invasion, it was a migration driven by climate change and desperation. The first recorded refugee crisis in human history. And here's the most chilling part. It could happen again. The Bronze Age civilizations were highly complex, deeply interconnected, and dependent on specific trade routes and climate conditions. Sound familiar? When the systems that support civilization are stretched to their limit, a single shock can bring everything down. But there's also hope in this story, because after every collapse, there is a rebirth. The Greek Dark Ages gave way to the Archaic Age, and eventually to classical Greek civilization. Athens, Sparta, democracy, philosophy, the foundations of Western thought. The Iron Age followed the Bronze Age. Iron was more abundant than tin and copper. New technologies emerged. New empires rose. But iron didn't arrive as an innovation. It arrived as a necessity. Without tin, without bronze, smiths across the Mediterranean were forced to experiment. Iron was everywhere underfoot. Harder to smelt, harder to work, but it was there. They turned to iron not because they chose to. They turned to it because they had nothing else. A new age begins not with celebration, but with desperation. The Phoenicians, survivors of the collapse, didn't just survive, they reimagined the world. Where Bronze Age trade had been palace-controlled, centralized, bureaucratic, dependent on kings, Phoenician trade was different. Decentralized, merchant-led, adaptable. It didn't need a palace to function. And the Phoenicians gave the world something more lasting than any trade good. Around 1050 BC, they developed a writing system of 22 consonants. Simple enough for any merchant to learn. Flexible enough to write any language. The Greeks borrowed it and added vowels. The Romans borrowed it from the Greeks. Every word you've ever read in English, French, Spanish, or German traces back to those 22 marks carved by Phoenician merchants on the shores of the Mediterranean. So the collapse wasn't the end, it was a reset. But the question remains, what really caused the Bronze Age collapse? The truth is probably all of these factors, hitting at the same time. And there may be factors we haven't discovered yet. New archaeological evidence is still being uncovered. A spearhead made of meteoric iron that fell from the sky, was recovered from Ugarit, dating to the exact period of the collapse. What else is still buried? A high-resolution pollen study from the Sea of Galilee region revealed a sudden, dramatic shift in vegetation around 1200 BC, consistent with a severe, prolonged drought. Centuries of growth replaced by mineral sediment in a single layer. The land itself recorded what the people forgot to write down. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that civilization is not permanent. It's not guaranteed. It's a fragile thing, built on foundations that can crack. These people, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the people of Ugarit, they were not primitive. They were us. They built, they traded, they wrote letters to each other, calling each other brother. And then, in a single generation, their world ended. The question isn't just what happened to them. The question is, what can they teach us? Because the past is never really past. It echoes.